About 15 minutes early just to go over some of these statements. Hopefully, you guys can hear me loud and clear. So, yeah, just a few comments since I'm reading out of the chat room, and I generally read out of the chat room. Someone mentioned the JHC Rem Destiny Marty talk that happened a while back ago, and I'm not a huge fan of that video in general. I'm not a huge fan of what happened there in general. And I don't like the types of rhetorical strategies that were employed there because I felt like they were pushing towards a sort of skepticism that I don't appreciate. Mostly like when people ask to justify things like epistemic norms, it seems sort of odd to me, and I think it should seem sort of odd to most people. Why? Because there just seems to be a handful of epistemic norms all over the place. Certain types of norms that we follow in not just epistemology, but within any sort of framework of justification. So people are going to assume certain types of epistemic norms all the time, like to employ modus ponens, modus tollens, to be consistent, to have some sort of continuity among one's own rationality. But there are other types of epistemic norms in certain types of domains, like the sciences, right? It's not like one is going to start going against certain types of practiced norms within the sciences, like thinking that gravity doesn't exist or electromagnetism doesn't exist. And presumably these types of norms that we are endorsing within the sciences are going to be endorsed through inferences and rational relations among our propositional beliefs. So when a person asks me why are there norms at all, it just seems like everyday experiences would be enough justification in order for us to be held under the assumption of having epistemic norms, unless there is a defeater of some sort that a person can provide. Now, a person or a skeptic can just say, well, I don't need a defeater, I need you to prove that epistemic norms exist. I've been recently kind of taking a little bit more of a deflationary response there and just kind of replying to these lately as I don't think I do. And furthermore, I don't think everything in life and in the heavens and the earth requires justification, nor do I think everything in the heavens and the earth needs an explanation or a reason to it if we're just dealing with ordinary sense experience or ordinary forms of inferential justification. It seems very, very plausible to me that any sort of inductive evidence that one is going to get is going to be generally within the science, within literature, within philosophy, anywhere going to be mostly a form of inferential justification that's going to evoke norms of some sort. And these norms are obviously going to be, in a sense, derivative from how the world works and operates, which, according to me, as many of you may know, I believe that it operates normatively as well. So you can offer a sort of eliminativist strategy of where all of justification, all of epistemic justification, is nothing more than a series of causal patterns of some sort. Some sort of natural explanation can be given, naturalistic explanation can be given. But I don't think JHC ever provided a single justification for that. He just kept pushing the burden of proof towards Rem and me. So I'm not really sure what there is to say about that. I mean, one can look in the world altogether and see norms all around us. I mean, even in linguistics, there's going to be certain types of norms. Within the English language, there's going to be certain types of norms. Within scientific discourse, there's going to be certain types of norms. There's not much to say, I think, after that. Now, if you wanted a harder justification for it, one from the ground up, I'm not sure what one would begin doing for that. We can look over that video, I guess. I mean, since we have some time. This was 2 years ago now, so my opinions have changed pretty substantially.
I no longer.
Let's see if I can bring it up.
No.
Have to be battered and bullied by you disgusting conscience.
Hello?
JHC, protect me against these epistemic realists. I can't do it.
Holy shit, is that Marty? Marty? Holy shit. How you doing, man?
He brought in Marty to bully me with his epistemic realism. He brought him in here to bully me, okay?
No. You asked me to bring someone in to call you an idiot, basically.
Okay. JHC, I'm going to reestablish my initial claim, because I don't even know where the fuck we're at now in this conversation, but so far, I am definitely losing, okay? The world is very real, okay? And I'm just too dumb to understand it. So my claim to Rem is that I don't know if we can know about the nature of anything in terms of epistemic truths, in terms of the physical world, in terms of whether or not we can trust our senses. I don't know if we can know about trusting any of those. However, I acknowledge that we have to function as though they do deliver us some true information. We have to function as though a priori assumptions are indeed true and that our senses do accurately convey information.
So let's give a sort of overview that I didn't do back then. I didn't do this largely because I didn't think this way completely back then, and I didn't have these refined thoughts 2 years ago. It's good. People move with their philosophy. They develop new opinions. But I think, as I said before, there's sort of ways of addressing these sorts of skeptical issues. One or two ways. One is a sort of maybe uninteresting way, but I think probably a more effective way than the second one that I'm about to reply to, depending on how much you want in terms of a philosophical answer. And the second one's going to be sort of a philosophical answer. So the first sort of reply to these sorts of skeptical dilemmas, and this is going to be the entire video if I recall correctly, is just to reply to this type of thing in a sort of deflationary response, and that's like, well, what do you mean that we can't know the external world? What do you mean that we can't know other minds? What do you mean that there aren't these things that are ordinarily within the world? And you gotta ask that person, why do I need to justify that? Because if they ask you, why do I need a justification for it, why can't I just reply with, well, why do I need a justification to give to you? Right? If they're asking for a justification, I can always ask, why do I even need to give a justification? If they want to play a certain type of skeptical game with you. It doesn't seem as though that everything within, again, the world requires justification altogether from the ground up, right? I don't think everything is philosophy, and I don't think a baker needs to know how they make bread, right? I think in virtue of them making bread, you know that they're making bread. I think in virtue of me walking down the road, there's a certain form of justification that I can give on how I walk down the road. But there's certain types of limitations to how anyone can give a form of justification, as in it reaches a certain type of dead end, and you say, well, my knowledge and the source of these sorts of beliefs come from a pre-theoretical, pre-philosophical world, right? They don't come from me trying to justify everything. And then I just ask that person over and over, why would I need to justify this? Why does everything need justification? Well, if you need justification for my justification, why can't I just ask you the same thing? It also seems when it comes to epistemic internalism versus externalism, that is how one can acquire knowledge. There's different types of strategies that one can do. One can say it's just all inferential justification all the way down, but it seems quite apparent, and I think it seems quite apparent to any sort of non-philosophers that there's probably an evolutionary basis for a lot of things about how we acquire knowledge, and all of them don't seem necessarily things that we do explicitly within our head, right? I mean, there seems to be a lot of dispositional qualities that human beings have and animals have that can gather up information and then just simply know how the world is, right? I doubt that animals are able to inferentially justify things through propositional content, because I doubt that animals, or at least most animals, a great majority of animals, know how to even use propositions or even understand what a language is, much less, any specific language like English or French or whatever. But I think it's very unrealistic to also say that, a spider doesn't weave its web and knows how to weave its web. And I'm using a colloquial, non-technical sense of the word know. I think it's very hard for, us to say things like, giraffes can't, in a sense, walk and they don't know how to walk, right? Things like proprioception, things like balance, these forms of know-how don't necessarily seem to require the same type of propositional don't require a propositional basis, and we never go about questioning these sorts of things. We understand these as a normal everyday form of learning and acquiring knowledge. So, I mean, I've recently been sort of upset and irritated at these types of skeptical dilemmas because I don't think that there's much at stake in there. I don't think really anybody believes that there's much at stake in there. I think they're going to run their lives as if they're not in a simulation hypothesis. Yeah, I mean, I don't think anybody really gives a shit.
World, but we can't know those are actually true. We just have to. That's my position essentially. And then Rem says I'm an idiot, and I think Marty is saying in nicer words that I'm an idiot. So go.
Do you know what time it is?
It's time for philosophy, JHC. That's what time it is. Okay.
So what's the argument so far?
Well, do you, for my positions as I've stated them, do you think that my positions are okay or
Oh yeah, I forgot. I'll give the second philosophical reply in a second.
Well, you actually, I think, said too much. So if the idea is, so what you said is that you have to think of things in a certain way in order to, like, let's just say survive or something like that.
So I'm not comfortable using the word have to. I guess I'm using it to avoid absurdity. So for instance, something like
we do it.
Yeah.
We do that. We do those things.
Descriptively,
right?
Yeah, sure. We don't normatively have to, but descriptively we do, right?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm okay with that.
Awesome. All right. Go. Beat him up.
So I guess
it's okay to say that we're describing things within the world and we do things in the world, but merely just saying that doesn't really do anything. So it's not that we merely do things in the world, it is that when we do things in the world, we have a series of justifications, a series of inferences, a series of norms that we generally operate, given and form consistent beliefs of which form certain types of rational relations where we can justify belief A in virtue of belief B, C, D, and so on and so forth. And we're not just describing the world, right? We're making endorsements all the time. So when I see a tree, right, there are certain types of norms that I particularly think I perceive to endorse the idea that I'm actually seeing a tree, namely if it has bark, if it has leaves, it has things like that, right? Then I can endorse that I am actually seeing a tree given that it conforms to those certain types of standards. Now, there might be certain types of exceptional cases of where our standards and norms are broken in virtue of new standards. But they're not broken insofar as they remove all and every single type of epistemic norm that we've ever acquainted ourselves with. There has to be a certain type of relationship of where novelty can form some sort of rational relation with the body of our beliefs. Otherwise, how could something that's completely an other to the types of beliefs that we have, that is so radically other, so radically different from our epistemic constellation of commitments that it can enter into it, right? Well, it couldn't. It could not enter into it if it was radically different.
I should say I'm indifferent. So I'm indifferent about. I don't think that I have the ability to know a priori if like I'm tracking the world correctly, or if what I'm doing is just thinking the way that I happen to think, right? Because those are really difficult to figure out a way to distinguish between them, because either way reality kind of acts and looks the same. So this is kind of like the Kantian dilemma, right? I'm Marty's here, so you guys have been fucking talking about Kant, I'm sure.
I think that's partially true if you take a Kantian perspective, but I don't, because I hold on to, if I was to hold on to Kant, which I'm mostly agnostic about, I would hold on to a dual world theory of Kant, and so I think that the epistemic preconditions do have an identity with the world. They're just not complete, right? So if you say that they don't have any identity relation with the world, then I don't see how you have knowledge whatsoever. But if they're just incomplete, and what I mean by that is like they don't completely tell us how the world is completely in itself, then I'm fine with that.
Yeah, so even like Kant, right, seems like he was wrong about some of his categories. So first of all, Kant's views are totally compatible.
JHC just ignored my statement.
With a certain kind of skepticism about.
I think that's just because JHC probably doesn't know the distinction between the two worlds theory and the dual aspect theory in Kant. It's fine. I've been reading some recent literature by Elias thinking that dichotomy. I mean, I believed that dichotomy back then, but I now believe that dichotomy might actually be not very, very helpful. So to sort of elaborate on what I meant by that is the two worlds theory in Kant of the noumenal-phenomenal distinction is such that the phenomenon has absolutely no sort of relation between the world and our idea of it, or a representation of it. So there's an ontological difference between the phenomenal and the noumenal world. But with the dual aspect view, there's going to be some sort of rational relation. There's going to be some sort of relation between how we represent the world and how the world is. And I think it's actually just it's just a conceptual and logical notion, an a priori notion, which I'm sure, in this video he disagrees with, and he just said he disagrees with. It's an a priori notion that anything that has a representation has something that which it represents. Something's being represented, it's logically and trivially true that something that which is coming into representation is representing something on the other end, right? Some sort of object of which my representation is of. That is what I'm saying is basically the dual aspect view in a sort of a nutshell. That relation itself, that logical relation, I think is just presupposed in any sort of perceptual experience. Given that there's no content for our faculties to represent, there's no experience whatsoever, yet the transcendental argument is that there is experience, therefore we have a representation, therefore logically and analytically there's something that we are representing.
About the world, right? Right?
I just want to clarify here. We're not talking about, like, I feel like we should stay away from external world, because really what the fundamental disagreement comes between Destiny and I
think Kant is supposed to be attacking.
So if it's not external world skepticism, is it about
epistemic theories?
Is it about like logic, or
sure, that works. Fundamental axioms.
Yeah, he even doubts things like the laws of non-contradiction and validity.
Okay. So here's the way that I would explain this. Is that what I would say is that obviously we assume that these logical laws are true, but they're necessarily unjustified. And even though it is inconceivable to me as a human that these things couldn't be true, it is possible. As a human, I can't make the claim that these, like the law of non-contradiction, is absolutely true. I feel like I can't make that claim. But what they're saying is, well, you're working within the laws of logic to make that claim, therefore you're ridiculous. Yeah.
Well, you might be ridiculous, but the question is does it because ridiculous is like kind of a social norm.
Yes,
So you probably are being ridiculous.
which I agree with, which
question-
is why I say
I don't think it's a social norm to say that you're being ridiculous. I think he's sort of equivocating right here between ridiculousness as a sort of social activity. Say I was in a party and I started throwing around baseballs at people's heads, right? There's a form of where that's ridiculous socially. There's a sense of where being ridiculous in terms of not fulfilling the correct not knowing what the symbolic notation of, say, addition is, and you're instead performing subtraction, right? You're not conforming to that norm, or you're not consistent within your beliefs. This seems to be ridiculous in another sort of way than from social conventions, and I think it's pretty apparent, so I'm not sure why he's bringing that up. What's with the frowny faces?
I would never function
No,
this way.
that is
See,
not
like-
what we mean.
Peterson. Is that Jack?
That is not
But-
what we mean by ridiculous.
That's literally
If-
what you said, like over and over.
But if
Yeah.
the question, well, but I mean, what Rem's
What I-
probably saying is that you're
real
doing
quick, what I'm
something
saying is that-
contradictory.
Yeah, just
Yeah,
because it's
exactly.
ridiculous or contradictory doesn't, because your systems are like self-verifying. It feels.
Oh,
Um,
but
yeah,
go
so
on,
the-
JT.
So what I would say is, I don't spend any of my time wondering if the laws of logic are like true, but do I have any reason to take them to be? Do I have a good reason? Do I have an argument to say that they're more than just the way that I have to think? As in, this is just the structure of thought,
Whoa.
and
Hold on. But
Go
look,
ahead.
if we're acknowledging that it's
Wait. He was about to say.
necessary
He was about to say
condition for
something
thought-
that I agree with. Can you let him finish? Keep going.
So what the Kantian argument is it simply that you can't separate the structures of thought from the structures of the world. Why? Because there are no structures of thought without structures of the world. No receptivity, no spontaneity.
so the question is are we saying something interesting about the world, or are we simply saying something interesting about the way that we happen to think? And that's a very hard argument to make, to go from well, it's really hard to think of how we could operate without them, to therefore these things are somehow like emblazoned into the fabric of the universe or something like that.
Well, they
But
don't
again,
have
I'm not talking about a metaphysical.
You
thing
keep going to the
here.
metaphysical thing, but I think it's.
I
think
do
it's,
not.
You just said it. You said that you're making it metaphysical, but I think that this conversation has to happen. To
Right,
I don't
discuss
because
these
think
things.
so.
I feel like it always goes. If you're gonna talk about these logical like these absolutes, I just want to know like what are the nature of these things that you are claiming are necessary for.
We don't know. We can't prescribe a metaphysical like.
Yeah, but you're saying
description
because
of
we
them.
can't know,
It's
it must be
impossible.
absolutely true. That's the problem that I have with that claim. Because we
No,
can't
it's
know
because
about a
even
world
to-
that is
no,
logically
it's
impossible.
Because to deny them is inconceivable.
Yeah, but just because
But
something
we
is
kind of
inconceivable
talked-
doesn't make it true.
But you can. You can pick and choose your logical axioms. I mean, I don't know.
Well,
I'll take your word for it that
No,
things like paraconsistent
no.
logic are not as robust as.
Again, we're
I
talking
maybe
about
have been told.
fundamental laws.
Well, it depends on how he goes about defining inconceivability and conceivability, but I don't really see a problem with saying things like, given that it logically contradicts, or given that we have a set of justified arguments, either A, what you're saying is literally impossible, and therefore not true in any possible world, and B, in the second one, is that we're justified in our beliefs to believe A over B, given the series of inferences and the series of beliefs that we have that are justified. So in the first one, if you do have a logical contradiction, that's all impossible means, right? A and not A at the same time. Impossible just means that there's no contradiction. So when there is a contradiction, it would just be impossible. When there isn't a contradiction, it would be possible. And then, those are just a priori arguments. Those are just logical necessities. And then there are certain types of arguments, like inductive arguments, where we have just a larger or greater basis in terms of some sort of probability to increase or decrease the sort of merits of our beliefs.
Yeah, but like again, like what I think what JHC said is true, that like these logical laws, are they features of our mind or features of the world? You exist within your mind. How could
I
you
don't
ever?
care. I don't fucking care about
Well,
that.
then wait. Then no, I don't care. That's my position. I'm the one
No,
that
but-
says you can't differentiate.
but-
You're the one that's saying
okay.
they're absolutely
And
features of the
Destiny-
world.
Destiny, okay, we're here, right? So now, when Ask Yourself comes to us and says, "Oh, hey, I can just assume the law of contradiction, and it's not a necessary condition of our experience," you can say, "Fuck you. It is a necessary condition of your experience." Yes or no, Destiny?
I never disagreed with that. But what I'm saying
my
is,
God.
No. What I'm saying is, just because something is a necessary condition for experience doesn't make it a true feature of the world. That we can't know about that. That's all I'm saying.
So let's say Ask Yourself comes on.
Why do we keep talking about Ask Yourself?
No, because this is what the root of it. Remember, the root of this.
The root of this is
moral
Ask Yourself.
realism.
Okay.
Hold on.
Oh, okay.
The root of this is moral realism, moral anti-realism. Correct?
Sure.
That's where this whole conversation sprawled
Kind
from.
of. When you
And
define
from-
moral
and-
realism as like your epistemic.
Yes.
Like yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So when I said moral realism, I of course said that we can say that moral statements have truth value. Not that we can know how we develop, or not that we can know that norms are, just that moral realism is true. Ask Yourself comes along, and I give the companions and guilt argument that if we don't have moral norms, then we don't have epistemic norms. And what does the epistemic anti-realist say? The only way out of that argument is to say, well, no, even epistemic theories we cannot say to have a true or false value. And you are clearly acknowledging me that there are necessarily someone must acknowledge, right? Someone must acknowledge that there are necessary epistemic conditions that are imposed on us.
Okay, can we solve this? Because we keep going back to this argument.
No,
You're gonna repeat something I've heard a million times before. This is what we have to resolve. Okay, just because something is a necessary experience for us to compute or calculate or whatever, talk about things, doesn't make those things like true features of the world. I don't think.
Hold on. When I'm talking about truth, why is truth necessarily a correspondence feature, Destiny? I'm not a correspondence theorist about truth.
Okay, wait. So when you say true, do you just mean like they're just ideas that we have and they may or may not correspond to reality at all? Wait, because if that's what you think the whole time, then that's fine. Then I agree with everything you.
So, to be honest, right here, this is 2 years ago, so it's been some time since we've had this conversation. But I think Rem is sort of confused here, and I might be confused later on. In that, I think you want to endorse something, and I think he wants to also endorse something like the identity theory of truth, which just states that if our experiences are true, then there is no asymmetry between them and the world. That is to say that there's just an identity statement between how our experiences are and how the world is. Now that is different from a theory of justification, because you can have a coherence theory of justification, and the coherence theory of justification can help you build identity statements. So I would just endorse both the identity theory of truth and, in a sense, the and the coherence theory of justification.
You said, and we don't agree with anything.
For all intents and the ultimate issue becomes, well, how do we choose between certain epistemic theories? Because the theory of truth is an epistemic theory. So we're going to get bogged down in that mess, which I don't really want to do, but I don't think it's totally necessary here. Because let's just say I'm a coherentist theory of truth, for example. Okay, then we acknowledge we have epistemic necessary conditions, okay? And that means that we do have these norms, okay? And then boom, we have moral statements that we know can be prescribed a truth value. Yes?
Wait, can you walk me through that again?
Oh, Destiny, we're so close. We're so close.
I don't think we are, because I think we're going to wind up with the same roadblock that we've gone through a million times.
Look, I don't know how many months it has been, okay? No one interrupt.
Well, because all I want to be able to say, all I want to say is that everything you're about to say, I'll assume it to be true. I just don't like that you're telling me that you can know about whether it's true. That's the only issue that we disagree on. But you're like
incapable. Epistemic theory, okay?
Okay.
What it takes for something to be knowledge is an epistemic theory, but you've acknowledged that there are epistemic things that are necessary conditions that we have to have. Okay? So there are epistemic features that are, we can say, categorically true.
Okay.
Because they're absolutely necessary. Okay? So we have categorical epistemic.
So, if you're a Kantian, which Rem was, I think, at the time, or at least Kantian to a certain type of extent, you don't need absolute necessities. You can have conditional necessities, which are a little bit different from hypothetical norms. So, and conditional necessity would be, given that I follow rationality, all this follows, right? You don't have to offer some sort of basis of argumentation that says this categorical norm is such that one has to follow it just absolutely no matter where they are in any sort of condition, because obviously that's not true, right? I mean, we have all sorts of norms. A person can decide not to follow those norms, often does for a lot of reasons. Why? Because they're not rational, they're not acting rational, and if you ask them why ought they act rational, what's going to obligate them other than rationality itself, which is going to be constitutive of their agency. So you can have a conditional necessity insofar as saying, well, given that rationality is true, given that we follow norms, right, and given that a constitutive aspect of our agency is these sorts of rational norms, then I must follow these sorts of norms, including ethical norms, if they are constitutive of our agency. So let's say if you're not to do that, right, let's say, okay, well, why do I have to act rationally? Well, it's that one doesn't really have a choice not to act rationally. Why? Because actions themselves are just defined as being able to make choices in virtue of norms. So as soon as one acts not rationally, one is not actually making actions, they're just making acts, and there's no distinction between causal activity and and actual agentic actions, right? So in order to act intentionally, in order to be an agent, in order to be a moral agent, you have to presumably subsume your actions underneath these types of norms. Otherwise, you ain't acting in any sort of way that merits what we'd call an action. You would just be sort of functioning dispositionally. So there's really nothing at stake, right? It's just another analytic truth, given that one is a rational agent, and all humans are. I mean, they're rational agents. They're able to make coherent and consistent statements, yada, yada, yada. Then, you know, all the rest of this follows. Now, it might be asked again, and this is asked over and over, why do we have to have even conditional conditional categorical norms of this sort? It's just because they're just constitutive of agency. For example, consistency and coherence is a constitutive and therefore a necessary byproduct of our epistemic capacities. That is to say, if you just don't do them, you're no longer acting rationally. And if you're not acting ethically, according to Kant, then you're not really free. You'd be always acting in accordance with your desires, dispositions, and all those types of things, which according to Kant isn't really free. In order to act free, you need to act in accordance with these constitutive and unconditioned norms that are privy of the human being's rationality. I'm repeating a lot of words here, but hopefully these words are just, consistent. I'm just going to use them consistently here and repetitively, because this is just what the Kantian framework demands of us, right? All these hypothetical norms that people bring out, and just in case you guys wanted me to define a hypothetical norm, it's just like, given that I have a certain means, I can accomplish a certain ends. Given that I want to become big, I can, I need to go to the gym. I ought to go to the gym. All these obviously are going to depend on some sort of further feature of the human mind, that is some sort of unconditioned necessity that gives us all of the other types of values. Otherwise, we never stop asking the question, well, why is that valuable? Why is that valuable? Well, those are all valuable because of a sort of intrinsic human nature, or because of an intrinsic and constitutive feature of our rationality. And here, when we're talking about ethics, we're talking about we're talking about practical reason instead of theoretical reason. And with epistemic norms, we're talking about theoretical reason. So if you don't act those ways, then you're not an agent, and you're just simply not making actions or choices.
Epistemic facts, okay? So the rebuttal to the companions in guilt
And yeah, Destiny
rebuttal,
was
basically saying that,
more
oh,
interested 2 years
well,
ago.
we don't have epistemic norms either. There's nothing necessary about in epistemology. That argument fails. So we go back to the companions in guilt and we say, okay, no, actually there are epistemic norms that we must necessarily have. That you've acknowledged we do have necessary epistemic norms, epistemic things in our
Okay.
experience that are necessary conditions. Hold on. So necessarily, the argument works and moral realism is true.
Okay, now here's my question to you, and you're going to claim that I'm making it now about metaphysics. JHC, you have to tell me if this is a fair question or not. My question is going to be, now, what happens if tomorrow you wake up and you were actually in an advanced simulation from a 9-dimensional world where things like causality and all these other truth values, that none of these things are actually features of that world. Everything... Everything in this current world was completely imagined and came from a totally other universe with different true things. Tell me, how can you tell me that that is not a possible thing? How could you know about that? Now, JHC, do you think that's a fair question? Okay, wait.
Yeah, the question isn't whether it's logically possible, it's whether it's metaphysically possible.
Wait, then what do we disagree on?
Because those are metaphysical statements.
Oh my God!
No, hold on. Solipsism is still compatible with moral realism.
Okay, so what do we actually disagree on? I don't know at this point.
We're talking about moral realism here.
Okay, wait, someone else is about to talk. Go.
I'm pretty sure the entire point of Destiny is that, like, you're establishing psychological facts, but not.
No, don't you dare even bring in psychological. You get so fucking triggered. You do not know. Oh my God, I'm getting flashbacks. I have PTSD, I think.
Your view of moral realism is just that moral statements are truth.
Yes, that's all I want to establish with Destiny.
Well, hold on, but I might necessarily believe that. It just depends on. Okay. I'm gonna use terms here. I
Destiny,
think.
Look.
No, wait. Let me just describe to Marty. So Marty knows my view, and he doesn't assume things from you. Okay. So my view, I don't know if this is considered error theory or not, but I believe that we can make moral statements that are true or false insofar as they adhere to some arbitrary system that we create. So, for instance, I could say right now, by the way, murder, that is something that I would consider not a virtue or whatever. That's a bad thing. So then somebody might say, oh, okay, so murder is wrong. So I would say I'm a moral realist insofar as, yeah.
So when we say that things are arbitrary, we're saying that any norm that we choose, or just say any sort of explanation that we choose, is as good as any other. And when we do that, what are we doing? We're not actually explaining anything. In order to explain something, you have to say something is non-arbitrary.
Yeah, you could say that murder is wrong insofar as it comports to this system I've created, but that system does not report anything accurate about the world. That system is totally mind-dependent, has no existence in the physical world, will never be found or discovered by anybody, and it is a totally arbitrary mind-dependent thing. So I'm a moral realist insofar as you can make true or false moral statements, but they correspond to systems that are wholly arbitrary and unjustified.
No, how can you say that when you've acknowledged that there are necessary conditions for experience?
Just because they're necessary conditions for experience doesn't mean that they're true.
So here's where I think these sorts of things go wrong, is that we're using a sort of language, and using words like arbitrary. We have to start asking, well, what does arbitrarily really mean? And why is everything that we're doing non-arbitrary? Well, presumably, when we use the word arbitrary, we have things in mind, right? We mean, well, I do A in virtue of no good reason whatsoever. That this is occurring because of really no justified explanation whatsoever. In that sense, it doesn't seem what I'm doing, right, in most inferential justifications is arbitrary. I seem to usually provide a reason for why I act. That reason is going to rely on some sort of other reason. We can go down that chain of reasons to an unconditional principle, and that unconditional principle is necessary, and it's reason giving, right? It's reason giving maybe in some sort of internal constitutive way. I'm not sure if that's arbitrary. I'm not sure if the series of inferences that we say are arbitrary. All right. So I'm not sure why they're using this type of language, that it all just boils down to something arbitrary. Maybe they're trying to ask for some sort of foundational epistemology, but the way that I see it is that our notion of arbitrary, and any information that we have on the notion of arbitrary is always going to stand against and in contrast to non-arbitrariness. That means that whenever we have a notion of arbitrariness, actually whenever we have a theory of error, non-error, convention and non-convention, these types of things, we have a built-in internal consistent model of these definitions that contrast one another. Meaning that the entire basis of the notion of arbitrary and non-arbitrary is a semantically holistic, coherent system that doesn't go outside of itself in order to justify itself. Meaning it doesn't make any sort of sense to ask, why is our entire system justified if the system is what is doing the justification internally? If the very notion of, say, things like appearances are only defined in virtue of their contrast, their non-appearances, or sorry, non-illusions versus illusions, then those are built in together, right? So let me give you a sort of example, right? When we start out with experiencing things, we don't have any sort of basis of error or non-error, right? We just have a sort of flat epistemology. We only get a sense of error and non-error, or illusion and non-illusion, or arbitrary versus non-arbitrary when we have at least two things that are tested against each other. So with ordinary vertical perceptions, I assume some sort of consistency, some sort of uniformity of perceptions. I assume certain types of standard epistemic norms associated with those, perceptual norms that I assume with those. So things that would avoid things like dreams, ghosts, mirages, all those things, right? Because presumably something about those perceptual events deems us to categorize them as being illusions or errors. And in virtue of those being illusions and errors, well, we know what isn't an illusion and error. We don't have to leap outside of the system in order to get at these definitions, because these definitions are internally built. And they're not just internally built by ourselves, but by the experiences that we have that we're receptive to. And so both spontaneity and receptivity work, as Kant thought, as a sort of unity. A unity of a coherent system that both identifies with the world and is going to be sort of parasitic upon our epistemic forms of justification. I hope that wasn't too unclear. So, in a way, when you look at the German idealist tradition, I think they truly think that there is nothing outside of the system of transcendental idealism. There is nothing outside of the system of absolute idealism, because the genesis, the sort of built-up of all these concepts, whether it be illusion, error, whatever, is all internal, all manifests itself internally and dialectically, well, especially for Hegel. So when we ask for things like, well, how could all these be illusions, right? We're misusing the word illusions, because we already know what illusions are. And if we're using in a way that isn't the typical form of illusion, if we mean, well, it's an illusion such that, all these events that we thought were illusions were actually not illusions, and it's this whole other thing, right? Then we're no longer talking about illusions, right? We're talking about smillusions. We're no longer talking about veridical experiences. We're talking about schma-veridical experiences. We're playing with language. And we're really doing nothing at that point, right? We're not operating under any sort of meaningful and coherent guidelines.
True.
How does that mean they're arbitrary? What does arbitrary mean?
We're subjective things that interpret the universe in the way that we do, but we can't know if our interpretation is correct.
Okay, hold on. Forget.
Yeah, so again, he seems to have like two forms of no. It seems like and this is where, again, I think a lot of people are playing with language. No one, and then like, I don't know, gnome squared or whatever. No squared. Okay, so in a way we know, right, that the Earth rotates over the sun, or, wood generally has a certain type of, I don't know, density. There's a certain volume. There's a certain type of volume of whatever. or a certain, I don't know, metric distance of certain types of objects. But then I have to ask the question, well, do I really know that? Well, what does that mean? What is the distinction between know and really know? If really know means something above and over know, then that's just schmo, and that really doesn't mean anything. What do we mean by know? It just means operating within the system of beliefs that we have, such that I have greater forms of justification for A over B.
They're necessary for us, but
Are
we
they
can't know if
okay.
those necessary. Oh, I feel like we're gonna go around in
Yeah.
circles again.
No,
Can I
hold
ask
on.
you guys some clarification questions?
Yeah, do it, because we're about to
Alright.
run around the same
It's like-
fucking circle.
No, we're
Holy
not.
shit!
No, we're
It's
not.
like divorce court, all right? Just relax. We're gonna split up your shit here in just a second. So, if the question is, do we have to have these epistemic norms? Are they necessary in order to think? I think that's like a really interesting question that seems unanswerable. If it's, are they necessary to the way?
Why are they unanswerable, I guess would be a good question here. It seems, again, constitutively and a priori, apparent to me that any sort of notion of knowledge that we have, any sort of notion of belief, any sort of representing, anything that we're talking about basically on how human beings act presupposes certain types of epistemic norms that we've already entered into. Now, are those all necessary? Well, they are if you want to talk about knowledge, right? Now, if you want to talk about schmolage or something that isn't knowledge in this sort of sense, if you just want to, again, exit the system of how we ordinarily talk and then adopt something that you use the word knowledge for, but has absolutely no connotation, and I literally mean all no and no connotations whatsoever to the word knowledge, then you're not talking about the same thing as us. You're equivocating, right?
That we think, maybe you could make that case. I don't actually know. Like, so for example, Kant seems to have been wrong about some of his
No,
categories.
why are we going
right?
back to Kant?
Well, just because I want to bring this up. For a long time, people thought that, like, Euclidean geometry, right? Euclidean geometry was something that we just couldn't doubt, but that turned out just empirically to be false. There are other things.
It's not a refutation of Kant's system.
Well,
Okay,
I'm
look,
just saying. Hold on,
Mark,
just
Mark,
wait. I'm
you
not
just
saying yet.
have their
There are
own
other
argument
things
about
that might
Kant.
be. There might be other things that are even more interesting, right? So there's this book by Eric Schwitzgebel. Are you familiar with Schwitzgebel at all? He wrote this book detailing all the ways in which we're wrong about the things that we didn't think we could be wrong about, the things that we directly experience, right? So some people, for a very long time, people thought that they dreamed in black and white, right? And then at some point that just changed. So I have a kind of skepticism. This isn't a direct, this is like an indirect
I
point.
think he's gonna say
I'm
skepticism
open
for
to
a
us being
priori
wrong
knowledge.
about like almost anything, right? So if we're going to come up with like a priori arguments about these are the things that are necessary for thought, they ought to be like really, really, really convincing in order to defeat the kind of like
They are.
insane skepticism that Destiny's putting forward and he's putting on my shoulders as well.
So, I like what JHC had to say there. That a priori or transcendental arguments ought to have a high bar, but I think that there's a sort of misunderstanding, maybe on the notion of Kant's part. So there's a certain sense of where transcendental arguments that are given by Kant aren't supposed to actually, so constitutive a priori arguments that try to show the categories of thought aren't putting into question external perceptions. They're not attempting to find out how the world operates. They're attempting to find out how the inner world operates. And it's true, the skeptic wanted to be skeptical of both the internal and the external world, then you need some sort of other argument other than a transcendental argument. But given that we're not skeptical of the internal world, because we think basically the statement, the belief in P, is just to be justified in P, at least with respect to knowing what's in our internal world. So just in virtue of knowing that I have a belief, in virtue of having a belief, I know that I have a belief. That's the only sort of real criterion as far as I'm concerned of having a justification for internal experience. But as long as we know that we have an internal experience, well, we know generally its constitutive features. Because if we were to remove those constitutive features, it doesn't seem like we are talking about experience in any sort of way, in any sort of meaningful way that we've generally and ordinarily talked about it. And some of these a priori assumptions in Kant do seem very, very, what's the word that JHC used here? Well, I guess extremely convincing, at least to me. Right. Well, what are some of those features, right? Well, what would an experience be if we had no concept of quality, right? Because this is one of the pure concepts of understanding that Kant gave us. Like, in virtue of having an experience, it seems as though a lot of the judgments that we're going to make are going to presuppose quality, modality, relation, and quantity. If they don't really have those sorts of things, we can't really call them experiences in any sort of sense that human beings are talking about experiences. We'd be talking about schma experiences, right? And another thing that he brought up, which, is fair, although I think that this is a straight kick in the nuts, basically. This is just like the cheapest shot that you can make against Kant, is Kant's presupposition of non-Euclidean geometry, or Euclidean geometry as a sort of built-in axiom of experience. And it turns out that, well, there's non-Euclidean geometry of two forms, right? I think one was hyperbolic geometry, and then I can't remember the other one that Einstein noticed. There might have been someone before Einstein who noticed it. And so Kant, assumes certain types of a priori axioms that aren't true. One, I'd have to say that I still think that there are certain types of a priori assumptions which have remained true for a long time, and those are in the mathematics. And those, as far as we have been able to tell, no inductive evidence has falsified the a priori arguments. And secondly, it seems as though a lot of the categories that Kant does use haven't been underwritten. I think the main one that seems to be underwritten is the notion of space and space-time, which I think inductive arguments might be said to give us reasons to believe that the a priori arguments that Kant had weren't tenable. And that's a reasonable point, right? I mean, it's just like, what are you going to say to something like that? I mean, you're going to have to say one or two things. You're going to say, well, it looks like most of the a priori arguments that he had worked. And unless there's good inductive arguments, good scientific inductive arguments, I'm justified in believing my a priori notions. As a matter of fact, I think that in order to even set off and do any philosophy, I'd have to have some sort of a priori notions. So I don't mind when people tell me that there could be inductive evidence that could, falsify a priori arguments. I think Quine actually had the same sort of idea as I did, is that if there is inductive evidence that suggests our a priori arguments are wrong, then they're wrong. But until then, I don't see any reason to deny the necessity of it if the necessity seems extremely plausible, like in these situations.
I just feel like if you're going to need that type of certainty, you might as well just give up on philosophy right now.
Well, no, but my argument, all I'm trying to say is that I don't think you need to worry about that certainty. You don't have to have it. Just say that we don't have it and then move on from there. Why is it such an absurd statement?
Destiny. Okay.
I don't know what he means by certainty.
Round two.
So nobody in philosophy is talking about, when they talk about epistemology, we're all fallibilists. We don't need certainty. We just need justification.
No. Wait, we have to let them talk. Because we've done this dance a million times. We're going to go this.
Marty and JHC have their own little, I think, about Kant.
Yeah, but I feel like JHC understands my position and can argue better than I can.
He gave you a totally indirect thing that is not relevant to our discussion.
Okay, but we're going to do the same thing over and over again.
JHC also has other crazy.
But like what's shut up, Marty. What's
Oh.
Oh, okay.
No, me and Marty have a history. He doesn't.
Yeah, I know.
But what are those things that we can't be wrong about?
Are you asking me?
I'm just
no. Ask Rem. Make Rem answer. What are some things that we absolutely can't be wrong about?
I think there's a difference an important difference between things that we can't be wrong about and things that are necessarily true. So it could just be that we find out that things that are necessarily true are wrong. You might say, well, this is weird. This is a weird use of necessity. Not really. It just says that, any sort of statement can be fallible. And the other one is just talking about modal suppositions. So yeah.
About REM.
Oh, I don't know. The law of contradiction.
Okay.
Right, but
Make
why,
'em prove
why
it.
Do we,
Sorry.
Why do you think that we can't be wrong about that?
Because
Yeah, I actually disagree with Rem here.
it's a necessary condition. Destiny, you acknowledge this. Are you
It's
going
a
back
necessary
on
condition for what? I understand that
Our
we
experience.
use it. I understand
our
that we
experience?
use
We
it.
cannot ever not abide by the law of contradiction.
How do you
We
know
can't even
that, though?
Okay, so
Fucking
again,
get
this
him,
is
run him
the
down!
The state. No. It's JHC's just being Marty. Yes or no? JHC is being a twat here.
Run him down,
I-
JHC.
Marty.
I am
Marty.
being
No,
a
I want to hear
twat.
Marty's response. Marty.
I don't know. My experience with JHC is that he very often
Poisoning the
replies
well.
with-
No, hold on. I want
very
to hear
often
Marty.
replies
Marty's
with, "I'm very skeptical of X, Y, and Z." Right? So it's just like, but I'm not skeptical of X, Y, and Z myself. Is just my reply.
No, hold on. So I'm skeptical that people can give.
Well, you're skeptical of
Good
everything,
arguments.
right? You're skeptical that we have qualia, that we have minds. You take a full eliminatist view. You're an anti-realist.
This is just a smear job.
Wait,
No,
but
I'm
actually,
confused.
but no. Why can't you just say? And this seems to be JHC's position. If I'm misinterpreting this, please tell me. Why can't you just
Thanks,
say
Tweak.
it's okay to be
It's not a
skeptical of
smear job, though.
what?
I'm not,
That's not
I'm
how
not
is that a
saying
smear
these,
job?
these things are bad. I'm just saying that's what you believe in,
Yeah, but
and I
wha-
just don't see how I could convince someone like JHC out of that.
Yeah,
Oh,
but-
I'm going to count that as support for my overall
How is that
argument.
support?
That,
Why-
How is that support?
why
because
can't
he's
you just
saying
say-
that he can't say anything to
I
me?
can hold
That's
the
my
view that
argument. Yeah, you
the
can't
thing that exists
convince-
in the world is
Yeah,
someone,
but I don't
like,
think you can
screaming at the top of their
convince-
lungs. That doesn't.
Well,
Why can't
no,
you
I
just?
mean,
So there's a sense, I don't know, it's been 2.5 years, but there's a sense of where not being able to convince somebody it doesn't mean the same thing as like not having an argument. So you could imagine a tyrant who's very angry and is acting through acts not in virtue of reasoned arguments, but in virtue of his emotions, non-cognitive reasons, to just shut you down, right? That's the limits of philosophy. If a person's unwilling to yield to reason, then there is nothing you could do, right? Short of taking up something by force to prevent that from occurring.
Say
It's the
that you
same
can't be
thing.
100% convinced of these things, but you could still have reasonable conversations about philosophy or morals or anything else.
No, look, all
No,
I'm
I don't
saying
think
is
we
it's
can.
about as hard as to convince of someone who's going to deny simple arithmetic or that they're.
What do you mean by?
performing
Hold on, but what do you
addition.
mean by deny arithmetic or addition? What do you mean by that?
So they
Do you
would
think that
they
I
would just be
don't do it,
denying.
or do you think that what I'm denying is that I have some kind of like meta proof for these things? I use
Well, I don't
them the
know what
same as you
mean
guys.
by meta-proof.
Like I don't
I
shop
don't think
at a
there's
grocery
anything
store.
beyond-
I don't
don't
shop
think
at a
there's-
grocery store differently
You
than you.
keep cutting him off, JHC.
I cut Marty off all the time.
Well, don't.
Go ahead, Marty.
Go ahead.
Well, I don't know what you mean in a meta sense. I don't think the analysis of math is a metaphysical question.
Look, if somebody says, "Why do you think that 2 + 2 = 4?" We're going to get to a point where I'm not going to offer like a really interesting argument. I'm just going to say, look, I don't. That's what I take 2 and 2 and plus sign and equal sign and 4 to mean.
Wow,
Right.
formalism.
Yeah, I agree with JHC here. I'm just saying that what else would we need? Why? This is just the criterion of knowledge. This is just the criterion of, I think, metaphysics as well. Because I don't really draw a sharp distinction between doing metaphysics and doing ordinary epistemology.
Beautiful.
Yeah, I think it's a formal problem, and that's what I'm saying, right? Is that there are certain types of dead ends like that.
Right.
But
Where
that
the
doesn't
chain
mean
of
that I
hold
don't
on.
think
Can I
that-
ask you a quick follow-up
I
question?
don't think
before
that
you keep going, Marty?
I don't think that means that they're unjustified.
I don't
think
have an
we
argument.
can
Hold
go
on. I'm not
above
arguing that
and
they're
beyond
unjustified, Marty.
an
I don't think that
argument.
they're unjustified. I just don't know if they're justified or not. Do you understand the difference? It's
Do
not
I
my
understand
position.
the difference between unjustified and justified?
Not
So, like,
knowing
what's your
if they're
version of
justified.
What's your version of justification?
I don't have a formal theory of justification.
Oh, of course.
But you don't have a formal. You don't have a theory of anything. Is the problem?
Yeah. There's nothing to object to here.
Well, I mean, you guys are just failing to provide an argument.
Yeah, the problem
Well,
is you're
yeah, but
providing
if your
unsatisfactory
argument
arguments
is-
and then getting
if
upset.
your argument is that no theory of anything will ever satisfy anything, and we can't know anything, and I'm a skeptic of everything, like, yeah, of course, I'm not.
Yeah, it's
I
kind of
don't
strong-manny.
intend to. I don't intend to.
It's not philosophy.
That's my hope, but that was it. If he says that he can't convince the ultimate skeptic, then that's it. That was my whole.
But the difference, Destiny, is that we can begin offering a priori arguments, intuition so we can begin talking
Let's
about
do it.
how certain things like
Yeah, but I think JHC.
logic are necessary.
Yeah,
No,
but I
I
think-
don't think you realize how
categories are
extreme JHC
necessary.
is.
But the
Maybe,
point of
or
JHC
I don't.
is
Well,
that
it
he's
feels like.
presumably done all these loops, Destiny. You haven't, so you might be able to be convinced by these intuitions, whereas JHC is just.
Oh, sure,
Yeah,
that's
he goes with
possible.
everything.
But every time I talk to somebody about it, I've never heard a convincing argument other than like kind of like the linguistic memes, like the or not even linguistic. This idea that like, well, because you exist within the bounds of logic, logic must be
Thank
true,
you.
which is a wholly unsatisfying, and maybe I might just be too dumb or haven't done the necessary groundwork to be convinced by that argument. But that argument is wholly unsatisfying to me. That because I
you
exist,
haven't, because
what?
you don't read philosophy.
Sure, I guess, but I mean like. Damn, so I have to read like thousands of pages of philosophy to
No,
understand that
you've
point. I
literally
mean,
said thousands of pages, but I'm just saying, like, in order to get a good sense of a good intuition going about of what's going on in philosophy and all these sorts of skeptical questions that, you know, historically largely took place what in the 16th, well, really like especially in the Greek era, but
sure.
couldn't
I just appeal then to JHC's authority here, since he has done a lot of reading?
No, because how many people have I brought on? Destiny.
yeah, sure you can. I'm just
I brought
saying,
in
like,
multiple PhDs.
JHC is going to have a certain type of I think dispositions that I'm not sure would be the same as yours.
Yeah, it's possible. I haven't stumbled onto any of them yet. The primary or the main thing just seems to be that I believe that Rem's claims, and maybe even your claims, I don't know particularly what you believe in, that Rem's claims are just too strong. However, I'm 100% okay.
My claims are too strong.
I'm 100% okay following
One of the
any of
weakest
his
claims in the world.
I'm 100% okay following any of the foundational moral realist claims, whatever. I follow those to the end of their logical extremities, and I'll entertain those arguments and do that. That's fine. I'm just uncomfortable saying that they're like foundationally from the absolute ground, from the highest order of truth, are 100% justified. But like the problem is that Rem seems to think that if I believe that,
I'm not sure if I ever said this, but I think coherence actually goes well with foundationalistic theories. So in virtue of creating a coherent web, we're also at the same time, especially at the genesis of conceptual, I don't know, I'm gonna have to offer a fancy term for this, conceptual generation. Like when we're forming concepts, right, there's a certain sense of where they're being founded in opposition to each other. That's generally what, you know, if you believe in coherentist theories, as soon as you have a positive claim, the contrary is going to be the exact opposite of that. So, you know, in virtue of something being soluble, right, there are things that aren't soluble. So in virtue of those properties, there's going to be certain types of things that are antithetical to those. In virtue of there being error, there's truth, right? So when we're creating an epistemology, we're basically creating it from the ground up. We're creating relations. So we're doing a form of coherence and a form of foundationalism at the same time. And that web keeps growing, right? Because our information keeps growing.
that I can't engage in any meaningful conversation, that I must be an epistemic realist, that I must, from the very foundation, believe that these things are 100% true features of the
No one's saying they must be 100%. That's just dumb.
universe, and that if I don't believe those things, I can't have any meaningful conversation. But I don't agree with that. Do you think that my position is ridiculous, or do you think Rem is correct with that? Because I do acknowledge that maybe there is some epistemic truth that I'd be convinced of if I were to browse the literature more, or actually like investigate the literature. But I think that, do you think that you can't be like an epistemic anti-realist and still have reasonable conversations about morals or political philosophy or anything like that?
Do you get? I mean, if you're interested,
let Marty
you can
answer.
read.
Let Marty answer. He asked Marty.
All right, go ahead, Marty.
Well, first of all, I wanted to tell JHC that I'm not trying to attack him by any means. I just disagree
just
with
let everybody know, Marty and I have known each other for a long time. We've had these
Yeah.
discussions a lot, so.
They were
Yeah.
lovers.
Yeah, we made out several times in Las Vegas. No, I mean I don't think that that's such a bad thing. I just think that, and I guess I haven't really been keeping up with your streams that often lately.
Can you expand upon the coherent web idea sometime? Well, I feel like I already have. So, we have a constellation of commitments, a web of beliefs, a logical space of reason. In the same sense that if we were to think, or maybe in a slightly different sense, that we were to think about the entire physical world, we generally think of it as a series of interconnected causal links. This hits that, X happens. These things are, pressed in a certain type of way, collide in a certain type of way, react in a certain type of way, where that's going to generate this action, and that action is going to generate another action. So there's a causal web right there, right? A physical causal web. There's another type of web, right? The web of epistemics, or justification. So we have a series of beliefs, right? And this is just, and generally when we say we want a series of consistent beliefs, we are forming rational relations between belief A such that it is consistent with belief B, and so on and so forth. And these branch off into many different types of directions, not just one direction to where there's a solid primary foundation of some sort. Although maybe you can do that in certain types of epistemologies. So, in virtue of believing that the moon exists, I might have also a tie to that belief and tides, right? Ocean tides. Or in virtue of it raining outside, I know that this is going to be providing water to flowers, in which they're going to participate in some sort of water cycle. In virtue of me knowing something about tectonic plate shifts, I might know how, mountains form or something like that. And in virtue of knowing that, I know another series of things. There's also a sort of linguistic web as well in language. We call this semantical holism, that in virtue of knowing what one word means, this sort of plays in relationship to what other words can't and can mean. When terms are synonymous, when terms are not synonymous, they play. The point is that one belief generally plays some sort of epistemically efficacious role to another belief that gives it merit and demerit. So if someone was proposing a theory of ghosts to me, I have obviously a series of beliefs, presumably justified in virtue of each other, that can give demerit or merit to ghosts, such as me knowing how basic scientific laws are, such as me knowing that things generally cannot be passed through, like ghosts can pass through things. So yeah, just this sort of epistemic web. So it's just sort of mind-boggling to me when just people deny that things like this exist. I don't think the correct question is like, well, do these absolutely exist? Who gives a shit if they absolutely exist in whatever way?
And how often you played the skepticism card.
Yeah,
What
I never do.
When you
I
were
never.
starting,
I never played the
Only with
skepticism
me.
card.
What I do
never.
recall, I do recall earlier you were like, okay, well, given that we can't prove all this shit, let's just assume what we do know and continue from there. If that's your general stance, I don't really have too big of a problem with that, as long as you at least pragmatically engage yourself in certain types of
No.
Yeah. Okay. Wait. No. Okay. That's
Nope.
it. I love you. Okay,
Marty,
that's fine.
you
So
don't
like,
realize.
wait.
Marty,
So
you
like,
don't
so for
realize.
instance, if I'm given
He's
like,
a moral anti-realist, Marty.
no. Here's the problem. The problem that I have with Rem. So what you just said, I 100% agree. If somebody was going to, for instance, argue with me, is raping women right or wrong? I'm never going to appeal to. How can you know that anyone is even actually being raped? Convince me of that. Like, I'm never going to make those appeals. Those are so absurd that I live my life as a realist in every conceivable way, because to do so otherwise is.
Can you come? So someone's asking, can you come to moral conclusions if you're not a realist? No. No, if you're a moral anti-realist, you'll never come
Is
to
the
any
definition
sort
of
conclusions.
absurdity. I totally acknowledge that. But the problem is, anytime I have any conversation or debate with Rem, it always boils down into epistemic realism. Somehow. It always gets there. So it feels like, so if you've like, yes,
realism.
all of our conversations,
Moral realism.
Sure, moral realism, sure, but your moral realism, it like boils down to epistemic realism because you get to epistemic realism from moral realism, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But look,
so again,
it's
wait, hold on. I just want to make sure that Marty understands because if Marty thinks that in every single conversation of philosophy, I'm like, well, nothing is
You
real,
basically
kid.
are, though.
No,
You don't
only
realize
with
how
you.
fast it
You,
goes up there.
but
The
you're
only
the
reason it
only
goes up there is
person.
'cause of you.
No, you're the
The
only person,
reason
but
it
that's
goes up there
because
is 'cause of you.
every single conversation we have. So Marty, if you listen to my conversation with Rem, it will boil down to that. But that's because every conversation I have with Rem, like, do you think that Pokemon is better than Digimon? Is somehow going to come back to
So if anyone was thinking, if anyone wanted to know, when I said all those things to Destiny, it's not that I believed in pragmatism and just being a pragmatist and whatever. It's just that I'm okay with ordinary people having those philosophical or pre-philosophical intuitions, right? That they're just not going. The ordinary man doesn't need to, nor ought to, without any sort of philosophical training, contemplate metaphysical truths above the ordinary sense of where we talk about knowledge. And to a large degree, I would just say, who the fuck cares? The world ain't going to make any sort of... The world's not going to be any different whether we affirm hypothesis A over hypothesis B.
an argument
So there's not much at stake.
on epistemicism
break.
every single time. So that's why it sounds like it. But otherwise, no, I would never pull out the ultimate skepticism card because it's totally worthless to consider in 99% of circumstances. Okay.
No, because look, if I talk to you about, well, should we do X or Y, right? Okay, and it's a moral question, okay? And then, oh, what moral system do you subscribe to? Oh, I don't know, some form of political egoism. You know, I do what's best for me, and therefore it's best for everyone else. And I'm like, oh, well, no, that's a really shitty worldview you have there.
Okay, whoa! You should
That's
be
a
able to
moral
convince me,
anti-realist.
but that's the problem. You should be able to convince me. I
No,
think
I
that
can't convince
you
you.
should be able to, because any other normal person would be able to. Any normal person with a good moral system could probably get me to buy into theirs, working within the bounds of what I believe is true, which is where I try to maximize, you know, what makes me happy. I think that most people can work. And when I talk to other people, I work within the bounds of their systems too. If I'm going to talk to a Republican about their stance on gay marriage or whatever, you don't.
Yeah, so I think Destiny's right here. You need some sort of theory of motivation to enact a moral system, because it's one thing to have a moral system. Let's say that moral realism is true, but the person's dispositional tendencies are counter or antithetical towards your motivation. That the person's motivations are counter to your ethical theory. Whatever your ethical theory is going to say doesn't matter or is never going to concern that person. So you're going to have to find some way of building a bridge. And secondly, I do think Rem has to find some sort of convincing argument in order to persuade people. You can't just say whatever and say, I'm not going to convince you.
I'm not going to sit here and try to appeal to some weird theory of morality or whatever. I'm going to talk within the bounds of Christianity. I don't think that my system is wholly ridiculous or unappealable to.
If I appeal to deontology, for example, you will have fundamental issues with that.
Yeah, because deontology is
you're an
fucking
epistemic
stupid. Of
anti-realist.
course I will.
Oh my! But the reason you think that is because you're an epistemic anti-realist.
No, I don't think you have to be an epistemic anti-realist to think that deontology is stupid. Marty, wait. Wait.
Your reasons for it are because.
Well,
you're
but
an
even if I was an epistemic, well, no.
Man, I love these days, man. I miss these days. I miss these days of where Destiny was still gave a shit about all these types of things and wanted to find answers. He seemed to get He seemed to have been sort of disinterested or disillusioned from this now.
Hold on, Marty. Is the only way to be an epistemic realist?
Yeah, Rem is a deontologist, by the way.
I don't say that.
Wait,
I didn't say
hold-
that's true. Don't
wait,
strawman me.
Okay,
Destiny.
hold on, wait. You would say, though, your epistemic realism is foundationally rooted in your moral realism. Yes or no?
No, other way around.
Your moral realism is... Wait, really?
Yeah, it's two sides of the same coin. That's ultimately what it comes to. All norms. I believe in universal norms.
Okay, I think it's possible that somebody could be an epistemic realist and still think deontology is stupid.
But I'm not saying otherwise. I'm just saying the reasons when we've talked about deontology.
Okay.
The reasons why is because we get you seem to be an epistemic anti-realist.
Okay, well, let's try. Okay, wait, let's do a sample. Okay,
well,
well, let's do it. Fucking speed. We're gonna speed run deontology right now. Okay, so
no,
okay.
because then we have to have this whole discussion about Kant again.
Well, no, I
No,
just want to
I'm
see.
already-
I just want to see if it's possible to have the discussion without it getting into epistemic anti-realism, because I feel like it should be able to, but maybe not. And
so
then Marty,
do you acknowledge that there are necessary conditions of experience test.
wait, you think that's how you have to have you have to start the argument of
How the
deontology
fuck
there?
do you think Kant's thought is structured?
Okay, so if you were talking to any layman in the street, and a layman was like, is murder wrong? Well, should I think about it being wrong based on how it causes things to happen in society?
Justification.
What?
Justification. We're talking about justification for a moral
No, I think Destiny's right. You don't need a meta-ethical theory in order to investigate normative ethics.
system. Not
Okay,
intuition.
but like, okay, here, let's do something very grounded, okay? Let's talk about criminal justice, okay? Somebody murdered somebody. Should they be punished for their actions, or should they be rehabilitated, right? Now, it seems like a utilitarian would lean towards rehabilitation, maybe because you can produce a better outcome for society, blah, 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 blah. But maybe a deontologist would say, well, no, this is a morally wrong act and we should punish for it. Okay, maybe not exactly, but like, this is how these concepts could come up, no?
I don't know. I don't think it. I don't,
Okay,
I
so
don't
like
think
in
that's a
terms
good
of like
example.
for somebody that committed an unforgivable crime, or somebody committed a bad crime, right? Should we just do what produces the best outcome for society, like forgive them and then rehabilitate them and move on, or should we actually charge them with a crime and force them to suffer because of their crime? This seems like it kind of like gets at kind of what deontology or utilitarians deal with, no, or consequentialism deal with, no.
Marty, do you think the correct deontologist perspective would say that we should be seeking
I'm not saying that they would
retributive justice?
necessarily deal with, they would necessarily say that, but that it kind of deals with similar concepts.
I don't know any adequate moral system that would ascribe.
Okay, so you're
something
telling me
lost
that
my
no
CCC
normal person could
combo
ever have a
because my account
conversation
got
on if
hacked.
I'm not
acts.
talking about a normal person. I'm talking about someone who's actually studied in ethical theory.
Okay, so you don't think that philosophy is worth engaging with anybody that doesn't have a formal background in it?
No, I think that those are precisely the moments that we have to engage with the person.
Yeah, because the view that it sounded like you were about to say yes, which is the most cancerous possible view you could have of philosophy.
No, but you can't start investigating these questions without reading philosophy.
But people do it all the time, so you're demonstrably wrong.
Yeah, I think he is demonstrably wrong.
What do you mean?
Yeah, but they do it badly then.
But
Yeah,
they still
do it badly.
So you're saying that so if you wanted to have a conversation with
So I said they do it badly. I think I can't remember exactly how my thoughts were. Again, 2 years ago. Badly in terms of if you're studying normative ethics, there's all sorts of books about supererogation, what we ought to do about the death penalty, and this literature, right? This is literature that I think goes into philosophy and then also outside of philosophy, and people make great points about it. And normative ethicists make great points about it. So in that sense, we need to listen to those people if they have reasonable things to say. And sometimes they might have the best answers, sometimes they don't. I mean, it just depends on what you're looking at. I don't expect normative ethicists to have a really good understanding of the Middle East sometimes. If they do, and they know both topics well, then they'll succeed in it. I don't think you need to know meta-ethics generally in order to have responses there, though, in normative ethics.
with somebody about how criminal justice works, your first argument would be, well, you need to read all of Kant, and then we can come back and revisit the conversation?
It's like someone trying to say which quantum mechanical interpretation is best when they haven't read any literature on the subject.
But people
Well,
aren't
yeah,
practicing quantum mechanics on a daily basis. Like,
I think in order to get a good theory going of ethics, that you're going to have to study ethics. Yeah.
and by ethics, you mean like have like a foundational like epistemic view of the world and then build from there, and it all has to be
you can
realistic?
forego the question of meta-ethics,
Oh, okay, so I did say that earlier.
but I'm not
Well-
sure if you
Wait,
can,
wait, wait.
forego the issue of ethics.
Okay, wait. I'm okay with that, I think, right?
Right? You don't give them any bad ideas.
I mean, I'm
not a
not
bad
saying that you ought not to investigate
Sure,
meta-ethics.
but I'm not
They're
asking that, but you're
incredibly
saying that
interesting.
you could have a discussion of ethics without fully 100% exploring everything there is to
Well,
explore about
there's
metaethics.
no logical contradiction entailing that you can't, right, Destiny? So like, of course you can. Logically, there's nothing wrong with doing that.
Well, I'm not saying logically can't you. I'm saying can you have a reasonable conversation?
Well, okay, well then, yeah, you know,
I
I'm
don't
not
think
really
so.
exactly sure what you mean by reasonable at that point, right? It
am
depends
I?
on what sort of normative standards you want to take by reasonable.
Because
And
if
I
I
don't mean
ask you to
that in a sort
justify
of
any of your
flippant way. I
ethical
mean,
statements,
I really want to know, like, even if you were to have like a sort of rough estimation of what you mean by like reasonable, what do you
Okay,
take
I
a
might
reasonable
end this video
conversation
early
to
because
be
I didn't
like?
want to go through the entire thing because this is just going to go in cycles, and we know what happened. We've already seen all this video ages ago. It's just going to continue basically more onto these sorts of issues, which I've already responded to a million times. No, I don't think you need to know meta ethics. At least I don't think you need to know meta ethics in order to do normative ethics of any sort for the reasons that I just gave. So, hold on just a second. So what else? What else? We had some other questions here, actually, in relation to this. Can you? Oop, looks like I need to eat soon too. Can you? Someone asked me to elaborate on that foundationalist. Specifically, if you specifically the part where you build it up from epistemic foundations were really interesting, in my opinion. I don't know how much more I could say to that I haven't already said before. So the idea is that when one is creating a foundation, say if we look at illusions and non-illusions and errors and non-errors and all that, right? We only get the notion of error through non-error and non-error through error, right? They're always come simultaneously with one another. If you don't have that dichotomy, you don't have that dichotomy, right? Like you can't just talk about skepticism if you don't have a notion of what it means not to be skeptical of certain types of things. You can't have a notion of error without non-error. These things suggest themselves to each other. They suggest themselves through content. They suggest themselves through propositional content and concepts and things like that. So we can imagine one beginning in epistemology with very, very basic concepts. And from those basic concepts, creating the concepts of error and non-error. So for example, I've given this story before, it's been a few months, of David the bow tie salesman who owns a bow tie shop. And David, for all of his life, just had veridical perceptions the entire time. Or you could just say, if you don't like this experience, just had experiences simpliciter. So anyways, he had these experiences, these veridical experiences, or these perceptual experiences of bow ties all his life, and then one day some light goes off, right, and changes the green tie into a yellow tie, and he says, well, I see this tie as being yellow, even though it's actually green and the light fixture is just changing it. And his friend goes up to him and says, well, that's a very odd thing. Wouldn't you think that as soon as this light goes on that it transforms into a different color all of a sudden? And so what would you expect David to do? Well, you would expect David to say, like, well, no, it just is what it is. It is what I'm seeing. The immediate experience is all that there is because I have no concept of error yet. As a matter of fact, I have no concept of truth because I haven't been able to create the concept of error in order to create the concept of truth. So the original propositional content that is given to us in perceptual experiences just suggests itself in this way until we come into conflict with this original perceptual experience that's immediate. How does that happen? Well, David is taken outside with the bow tie with his friend, and he says, see, it's actually green instead of yellow. It was just a light fixture. Just the light basically making it appear a certain different type of color. And then David says, I see. These things could influence the color such that it is not the initial color that it's supposed to be. And so new and novel experiences generate the dichotomy. That is the genesis that we need to be looking at, is that error is not just something that we can perpetually slide into any conversation and just say we can perceptually be always in error. It has to come with conceptually latent suppositions that we're familiar with these errors when an experience informs us of what things are like to be in an error in.
Like when we
Oh yeah, so I've already seen enough of that video. So that, I mean, like, that could be, you know, one basis in epistemology. There's one basis in metaphysics and ontology and in the science of logic that Hegel gives, like that being creates non-being and that creates becoming. And I've already given this sort of spiel before. It's a very sort of interesting spiel of how concepts, original concepts of understanding originate. Much in the same way that I've given you the story about David the Bow Tie salesman, which I can, if someone wants me to go over the science of logic again, I could give that story. Why did Destiny stop doing philosophy talks? Well, it's because I mean, some of us haven't been bothering him anymore, and when we try to bother him, he doesn't seem that interested, so he says he might get back into it later on, but as for now, he sees it as a sort of dead end, and I don't blame him, because a lot of the philosophers that talk to him don't know what they're talking about, and or if they know what they're talking about to some extent, they don't have quite the language to situate him into the right direction, because that requires a certain mastery of the subject, which, you know, I'll even admit that I don't have the mastery of a certain type of subject to be able to communicate all the information effectively that might be able to convince a person like him. Anyways, hopefully that was somewhat helpful. I didn't want to go through this any more of this video because I don't know what else there is to say that I haven't already said, and I haven't seen JHC in 2 years. Maybe he'll watch this video. I remember also seeing another video that JHC posted up, because he had a few more where he talks to Just Destiny and Rem Without Me, and he makes fun of Rem for being too enthusiastic about metaphysics, and then he says the only reason he's enthusiastic is because he's an undergraduate, which I found funny because, you know, then he immediately objected about that smear campaign thing. It's not good faith acting, and this is sort of why I get frustrated with these conversations in general. One of the things that I wanted to talk about, I think, in the stream is rhetoric, epistemic humility, and how philosophical discourse ought to occur, because I don't think that this happens often. So let me change the topic then. Let me eliminate these things that I had earlier. So I think, and these are maybe, you know, I haven't really thought about too many of these types of things. So I'm going kind of off the cuff here when I'm talking about philosophical virtues and how a discussion ought to be held, and how I often don't see people like JHC, Ask Yourself, or a lot of other people acting. I will say, to give some charity to JHC, I think he's definitely gotten better. I haven't met him in 2 years, but I mean, that conversation with him was a lot better than some of the earlier ones that I had. And some of my friends said that they're friends of JHC and that he's actually a nice guy, so it's just unfortunate that whatever happened with him and Rem and me at that time, because I'm sure there could have been much more interesting conversations with GHC. But one of the things that I don't like in philosophical debates and philosophical discussions, and to even begin, I don't really like debates all too much, because debates fundamentally break a sort of virtue, I think, that I uphold in most serious conversations, and that's, they seem to break the general virtue of the pursuit of truth by combating your interlocutor such that you're attempting to win and not discover truth. So if that is your overall pursuit, if philosophy is just to basically be non-courteous, be hostile, combative, and try to win, try to dunk on your interlocutor, if these are your virtues, right, then I don't think you're really pursuing truth. You're actually placing yourself as a sort of barrier into the natural progression of it, because if any of these conversations were supposed to go how they could have, then there would have been at least some sort of positive replies by these other people to where they can give us other alternative routes on how to do philosophy instead of just pulling the skeptic card or pulling the I'm a little bit skeptical of what you're saying card. I don't know if anything can really be proven, yada, yada, yada. And then also just throwing at homonyms or just insults. That doesn't do anything. It doesn't progress philosophy. It doesn't actually get us anywhere. It's just a form of rhetorical clobbering that that pushes a sort of dispositional quality into the person such that they become incredulous. I was in a conversation actually recently of where someone asked me, and that person might be watching, why am I arguing for certain types of things that I don't have definitive answers to? And that's just simply because if you don't have the answers to in philosophy and people are expecting all these amazing answers from you, is that you still have intuitions. And intuitions, regardless of what people say, are very persuasive and need to be investigated. That's how all philosophy sort of begins with, is intuitions. And when people say intuitions aren't arguments, I simply at that point respond, what do you mean? Of course they are. A lot of persuasion occurs at an intuitive level. I mean, I persuade all my friends off of intuitions all the time. All the time. All the time. You do too. Everyone does. Anyways, 1 second. Be right back. Sorry about that, guys. He still tweets, so he's not dead at least, but he hasn't stopped by Tom's unboxing in a while. That's fine. That place is trash, anyways. Why does it always come back to Socrates and Aristotle? I don't know what you mean by that. That's the culture that gets fostered online. Yeah, I mean, God, I was listening to one of my sort of philosophical. I guess he's not even a philosopher. He was more like a psychiatrist and neurologist. Talk about the internet. It's just like thinking back on it, like when the internet was sort of in its infantile stages, when it's still young. sort of had this general expectation that the internet was going to become a sort of social haven of the exchange of ideas and things like that. And that's absolutely not what it came down to. It came down to entertainment and porn, large porn industry. And the Discord community in general, the people who talk about the philosophy there are just really out there to, I think, win. Win, rhetorically clob you down, and not investigate philosophy to any sort of extent of where they're going to steel man your argument. Because if you do take philosophy seriously, then one of the types of responsibilities that I think you have, both hypothetical or categorical, but at least hypothetical, is the pursuit of truth, which means taking what your interlocutor is saying and making the most of it even more than they can. But that's not what I see, and that's just not what people do in a very everyday practical scenario. They instead clarify and clarify and clarify and try to determine what you're saying to the point where it's vacuous, to try to admit to you that you're wrong. And then a lot of what I've been trying to see is attempting to humiliate the individual. And then these same people say that I don't care about your feelings, I only care about truth. But I think it's just precisely when you aren't gracious, that you're not pursuing truth, in the same sense that when people aren't being clear, they're not pursuing truth. So a lot of people bring up clarity. Well, I think you need more than clarity. I think you need clarity and grace. So, let's see. I didn't have any sort of long dialogue prepared right here, but we have been going about 2 hours, so I might just cut it here for an episode. Do want to apologize for not being on lately. It's definitely caused a sort of rift in the amount of audience members that are participating in these streams. I can't make any promises that I'll be making more frequent streams right now, because I am applying to a few universities so I can get my PhD going. And it's going to be very difficult, especially with COVID. If any of you guys aren't applying to universities right now, especially for a PhD program, the amount of students that are being admitted to universities is significantly decreased due to COVID. I at least know in the college that I'm teaching, we have, if not fewer classes with at least 15 to 10 less people being admitted into them. And I would think, as a byproduct of that, you would have, even in my college, less people admitted into the institution. Maybe a little bit different probably with community colleges that have to take on the student, but less so universities, especially if they're prestigious universities that want to keep a limited array of people in them. And it's especially going to be competitive in the sense that who you're competing against aren't people who are procrastinating and waiting until COVID's done in order to get their philosophy PhD and their doctorate, right? They're going to be doing it immediately. It's a very competitive world out there. So it's going to be viciously hard to get into a PhD program. But hopefully it'll work out, at least if not this semester, this year, it'll work out next year. So that's what I've been doing a little bit, and why I've not been on the streams as of recent. So we'll see how the future pans out. But anyways, I'll take a moment. We don't have too many people in here for any questions. If you guys have any questions, I'll do that for a brief bit, and then I'll call it a day with you guys. Oh, and one other thing that I've been starting to do is D&D. I am now a DMM. I am doing the Avernus campaign soon with some friends. The Descent Down to Inverness and the Baldur's Gate campaign. Can you be an epistemic anti-realist and a moral realist? If we take moral realism to mean that moral statements are propositionally either true or false, then I think those are going to be dependent upon certain types of epistemic norms. Therefore, you can't be a moral realist and an epistemic anti-realist. But if moral realism is a type of naturalistic realism, where people are somehow tied to doing things naturalistically and causally without propositions, and there just existed some sort of moral compass that was just built into our biology or something like that, or to our neuroscience that we just weren't propositionally aware of, then yeah, maybe. I don't know how you would come about proving such a thing. Yeah, philosophical D&D campaign content, let's fucking go. Yeah, I mean, if all my friends were philosophers and they were interested in all that, we'd be able to do it, unless you mean like me as a DM just somehow introducing philosophical elements to where people have to participate in those elements, Does epistemic realism imply that humans are able to define universals? Yeah, I think so, if I get what you mean. Well, there's definitely going to be moral dilemmas in the D&D campaign. So the Descent Down to Avernus is basically the first level of 9 Hells in the D&D world, in the Forgotten Realms. So basically what's going to happen is devils are going to be constantly interacting with you and trying to persuade you into take a what do you call it, an agreement with them. There's a contract of some sort, and generally the contracts are out to set two things: steal your soul and make you work for that demon so they can assess or they can amass followers. So there's going to be that moral dilemma in the sense that it's very, very difficult to survive in Avernus. Anything that you eat tastes bad. It doesn't refresh you as easily. There's no place to sleep. It's very hot. There's lava. There's all sorts of things. Dante's Inferno-esque environment. And so devils are going to be great ways of just like easing that and giving you free levels. And so it's very tempting. So, it could be a sort of fun ethical dilemma there. Anyways, guys, I don't think we're going to get any more